So I would like to introduce David Brooks, and so very happy to be welcoming him here. I've gone out and presented a few times, and also on Zoom during that era, some programs with him and his sites and such, but it's great to have him here at Brookside. And it's a really fascinating topic. We have focused a lot here on the 77th New York State Volunteer Regiment, but there were so many Saratoga County residents who were part of the 115th as well. So really looking forward to hearing more about that group this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. And you're welcome.
I always find being introduced kind of strange. So as I start out, I'll give you a little bit of the background. I'm doing this on behalf of the Fulton County Historical Society, in which I am a board member. And I come to this with a personal connection through family, as probably much of you who are interested in a topic like this would be connected to it. I cannot say that this is a complete history of the regiment, because that would take far longer than any of the time that you might have available this evening. I see a copy of Mark Silo's book over there. I also see James H. Clark's book on the table. If you're really interested in the 115th, Mark Silo's book, if you're able to find this, it's a tremendous resource. He did a tremendous amount of work on it, and it is worthwhile. Again, there's a copy on the table as he breaks that down using a lot of great primary resources. So I feel comfortable leveraging some of my research into what he's already set that groundwork for, as well as James Clark's regimental history, James Clark having been in the regiment, and so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I thank you all for being here this evening. As you can tell, there's some music, and I was asked at one point or another during this program in another location, I should let you know there'll be other sounds. So just be aware of that. All right? So I mentioned Mark Silo's book, and in his preface to that book, he writes, "The railroad switches that moved them away from the mainline track during the middle of the night started the 115th on an odyssey that encompassed 34 months, 6,000 miles, 800 casualties, and a story that is unique among the fighting units of the Civil War." And I hope this evening, as we go through this abridged version of the regimental history, you'll understand and realize that that is a very true statement. It's a very unique history, and they covered a lot of territory. But we'll start with a call to arms. And that call to arms led boys in blue to depart tracks from Fonda, New York, 161 years ago. As you're probably familiar, this group, honestly, you all look like you learned about American history in high school, which I'm not. That's not a shot at your age demographic. I'm just saying you're all of the age where you would have learned about the Civil War, right? So you're probably familiar with the secession of the southern states after Lincoln's election and the outbreak of the war, the First Manassas or Bull Run, and the need for, particularly in this area of the North, the call to arms to fill out those ranks. And that means in the 50th Senatorial District, a sprawling upstate New York community of the counties of Montgomery, Fulton, Saratoga, and Hamilton, were asked, as part of Lincoln's call for an additional 30,000 troops, Under Governor Morgan, the push from New York State was to fill out those ranks, and they were tasked again with completing a 1,000-man regiment to take the field. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. And as those boys in blue did depart the tracks from Fonda, New York, which I'll show in a moment, they were destined to print themselves into the pages of history, unnamed or faceless. Their contributions, like many others, can yet be felt in our lives today, as they each experience the moments, the emotions of life, of war, loss, victory, tedium, disappointment, triumph, frustration, and dismay. Their souls reverberate, intertwined with ours as we are here this evening. Those that sacrificed their all, those that came back home different men, those who paid a silent price, they're all here forever with us on the home front. No matter where their earthly bones came to rest, they're here to connect us. Perhaps unknowingly to our very own earthly bonds, as we are humans, that therefore we must be connected to our past and each other. The image you see here, this is Colonel Simeon Sammons. Simeon Sammons was age 41, a local farmer and militia commander, making him a pretty obvious choice to be the colonel of a regiment. Additionally, he was town supervisor, president of the Agricultural Society, a chairman of the County Democratic Committee, and a member of the New York State Legislature. He came from a well-known, well-to-do family. Again, all the more reasons to make him the colonel of a regiment. And those boys recruited from those 4 counties were all to convene at Camp Fonda, or Camp Mohawk. They were to report by August 18th, and they were mustered in by the 26th, 1862. Has anybody been through that part of Fonda? You go down the hill, if you're leaving like Johnstown area, you can drop down into Fonda. It's where they have the dental area and where the town of Mohawk just built that really large, I'll say it, very, very large firehouse. That is where Camp Mohawk was, where the 115th was mustered in to service. And with their bright new flags presented to them by the Women's Auxiliary, being funded by the donations of communities in those 4 counties, they set off, they broke camp, and they were off to war on August 29th. And each step closer to the front, it would be noted, particularly in James Clark's book, that their accommodations became more and more uncomfortable. They left on first-class cars from Fonda. They leave the train station. By the time they get down to New York City, they're on immigrant cars or cattle cars, and eventually will board ships and head to Maryland. And I use that image, actually. This is a part of a postcard that was sent to Peter Keck, who was the 115th. So this is from a collection surrounding an actual veteran. So I had to use that, right? And again, they're off to Harpers Ferry. Within days, they're quickly at the front. Now imagine this. You just mustered in, you've drilled, and you're off to war. Very little time. You're very green. And these are, basically average ages in the early 20s, young men going off to war. They're excited, and they're around friends and family. There's a fun story in Clark's book about a guy getting lost off the train on their way down. Apparently he made a hop off and didn't quite make it back on. Somehow he managed to eventually make his way back to the regiment before they left, so he didn't get in any real trouble for that. But young men will be young men. Lee's army at this point in time, if you're familiar, Robert E. Lee is the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they're making a push into the north, into Maryland. And in doing so, they're collapsing in around that section of the Potomac River. And it's a very successful Confederate summer campaign, moving the war out of Virginia and across the Mason-Dixon into federal territory. By September 4th, the 115th would be deployed to Bolivar Heights. It's the land approach to Harpers Ferry. That's the notorious armory site, if you're familiar with, leading up to the Civil War, with John Brown had performed a raid to arm the insurrection or the rising up of enslaved folks to fight for their freedom. John Brown's raid happening 3 years prior, still fresh in the memory of those that are going to be there for this conflict. They're under Union Commander Colonel Dixon Miles, who happens to be the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. His forces are ill-suited. He's got plenty of green troops. They're poorly positioned in a very indefensible position. It's easy to take Harpers Ferry. It's quite another thing to hold Harpers Ferry. So as Lee does what Lee does, he divides his forces. He moves into 4 bodies of troops. The infamous Stonewall Jackson will move against Harpers Ferry, and the 14,000 Union soldiers that occupy that space. A.P. Hill, General A.P. Hill, the Confederacy, will move in from the south, bottling them up. And the 115th see their first action along Maryland Heights on the 13th of September, just within 2 weeks of mustering in as federal troops. As to this point, Captain William Smith, he's a carriage maker from Amsterdam, is the first officer killed, as a mini ball will hit his thigh and will eventually lead to his bleeding to death. Private Van Brocklin is the first private to be killed, all along that early conflict in Maryland Heights. It's also during this period of time that a Miss Lucy Bertrand, who had come to serve with her husband as a seamstress, as a cook, and a laundress, is called out as she's amongst the troops on the front lines by a superior officer of another unit, saying that the presence of a woman would be disparaging to the rest of the troops and it would have an ill impact on their morale. And her retort was to the effect of that it was before her that their spirits would be so high. I think it's a good comeback, if you ask me. But on September 15th at 8:30 in the morning, Colonel Miles will surrender the entire Union force. The 115th had suffered the first mortal casualties, and they would continue to suffer death, disease, and injustice. The very first taste of the cruelty of war. However, Colonel Miles doesn't get to savor that flavor much because he is killed by a shell just before the official surrender to A.P. Hill. There could be quite a few things said about Colonel Miles if he had survived the court-martial and investigation that could have been had in that situation. So at this point, the Confederates will take on the Union prisoners and parole them, and that frees up the Confederate troops to take off with Stonewall Jackson into other parts of Maryland nearby. The 115th during this will secret away their colors wrapped around the bodies of unknown soldiers, the stanchions being returned with tent cloth wrapped around them instead. Many of the guns, the rifles, and other military equipment, the troops destroyed, broke, or otherwise deemed inoperable as they stacked them to walk off as prisoners. And if you could only imagine the disappointment and dismay, I think at one point or another, all of us in this room can remember being perhaps in your early 20s or late teens, and the emotions that go behind that, and how strongly you felt everything. Gosh, being a teenager was terrible, wasn't it? But there's something to be said about getting old. The alternative isn't very good, I hear. So they're often paroled. This is an era in which paroling happens. The troops have to sign papers saying they will not fight for the Union Army until they are paroled, or until they are exchanged for Confederate prisoners. So the Union will have to give up Confederate prisoners, and that's where they'll exchange them. It's at this point that they march to Annapolis, Maryland, averaging about 20 miles per day. And during part of that march, they're within earshot of the raging battle of Antietam. So those forces that they had just fought and surrendered to are now engaged in the single bloodiest battle in American history. They arrive in Annapolis on the 21st of September and are sent almost immediately to Camp Douglas, just outside of Chicago, Illinois. They arrived there on the 28th. So in less than 30 days of active service, they have traveled over 1,500 miles. 160 acres is Camp Douglas. It's by Lake Michigan. It had been a training camp that became a prisoner of war camp. Eventually, when the parole system and exchange system ends, it becomes a prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. The 115th at this time, however, is one of 3 regiments that are held at the Illinois State Fairgrounds, using the stables as barracks. You can imagine at this point in time, the tedium grows. Fueled with the disappointment and anger of their situation, there's several bouts of drunkenness. They call French leave, where men will take off, they desert. They just never are to return. There's theft, absence, disorderly conduct. There's even counts of arson and near mutiny amongst the federal troops. Private McKnight out of Company I, Saratoga County boy, gets himself in a little trouble for an evening of drinking in which he used some expletives toward his commanding officers and called one something to the effect of son of a bitch. Didn't go over well, so he was punished by having to carry 30 pounds of rock in a sack over the course of 2 days. And to stifle and stem this kind of tide of the French leave, some of the soldiers would write home, and their letters to the family would go to also the newspapers, talking about the conditions, but also listing the men that disappeared, so that when they showed their face back up in town, particularly in places like Amsterdam, it was known that they were absent without leave, and very disgraced in that way. Lieutenant James Clark, I would mention, it's got his regimental history over here, mentions that the 115th was not amongst those that threatened mutiny. In fact, they were a regiment that was tasked with basically becoming NPs within the camp. Some of them were even rearmed to keep control of the other federal troops. That does them no favors amongst their own soldiers, where they're viewed as bullies, or they're viewed as turncoats to their anger. By November 1st, disease had riddled the ranks. Hundreds are sick, and over 3 dozen alone die from the 115th. But farewell, paradise of mud. On November 20th, they are able to leave Camp Douglas, finally being paroled. They're exchanged for other Confederate prisoners, and they will arrive in Baltimore on November 23rd, 1862, where they will then move to Washington, D.C., spending the first night at Camp Chase, and on the 25th in Virginia along Arlington Heights. Anybody familiar with Arlington National Cemetery? Anybody familiar with the fact that that was General Lee's property? No. Winter camp work will begin. They set up their winter tents, and they're ordered to move out. They erect new winter huts, and within 2 weeks, they move out again. Colonel Sammons will write a letter calling the 115th the Flying Infantry. Regimental Surgeon Dr. Sutton signed correspondence, quote, Governor Morgan's Flying Infantry, Headquarters, 115th Regiment, New York State Volunteers. This time, they'd be sent off again, where they would set up winter camp outside Yorktown, work on drills and training, giving them the skills that they would need, and a routine and discipline that they absolutely require. It's at this point in time, too, that the U.S. Commissary will send them supplies, stationery, coffee. They receive packages from home, of which is a package of poultry, preserved. Well, it was supposed to be preserved. It arrives rotten. So members of the 115th do what soldiers are supposed to do, and they give that poultry a full military burial. Apparently it didn't go over too well with some of the troops nearby, though. By January 21st, orders are to move again, and they're sent to Hilton Head, South Carolina. It was there that the regiment was notified that it was under arrest and without pay, under the charges of arson at Camp Douglas. The barracks that they had stayed in as they left on the train had burnt to the ground. Now, there's several different accounts on this. Those that are back at the camp are saying the 115th set the place on fire. They tipped over their stoves, and they were cheering as they left because they knew they were burning down the squalid conditions of their camp. The other side of the story is they were happy and cheering because they got to leave, and that in the looting of the barracks by other federal troops that saw no kind favors toward the 115th for having been overseen by them during a mutinous period, set the place on fire. So that argument's going to be had in the military courts outside of Washington. Colonel Sammons will leave to clear them of their conviction and defend the regiment against wicked, false allegations. That would take about 2 months to do. On March 25th, Sammons returns with redemption and the paymaster. Probably a welcome sign. I don't know which one of them they would have enjoyed seeing more. Camp life at Hilton Head, however, involves manual labor as forms of either what they consider is their punishment even after clearing them of conviction. They are there to perform manual labor tasks, such as loading and unloading of supplies. But this is also where their first encounters with the USCT, the U.S. colored troops, would happen. And although openly they would mock local black, they never did so to other boys in blue. There was something about the respect of that uniform, and they would come to find out that some of their closest combatant allies later on in the war would be some of these very own USCT troops. Company B and E are deployed in early June 1863 for raids into Georgia and South Carolina and the destruction of Buffington, South Carolina. They encounter several small skirmishes, a little bit of loss of life, and injuries along the way. At the end of June, the entire unit is redeployed to Beaufort, South Carolina, and they take on 164 new recruits into the 115th, some of them being veteran of other units, most of them being green recruits, filling out the ranks because of the loss from death, disease, and injury. There are several more of the 115th. They go on to be provost guards of the MPs. They continue and transfer. There are others that go on, like Charles Mingay, which I don't think there's that image there, becomes a steward of the hospital at Hilton Head. He has a background in pharmaceuticals, being of this area. Ann's not here, but it's either Saratoga or Ballston Spa. The family owned a pharmacy. You seem familiar with it,
yeah,
Saratoga.
Yeah.
Yep. That's why I tucked that in here. I'm in Saratoga County. I have to. That is just cheap pandering to the audience. And while they are at Hilton Head, as I mentioned, they are going to assist also with the return of what remained of the 54th Massachusetts after their assault on Fort Wagner. If anybody's here has seen Glory or otherwise is familiar with the more true version of that story of the 54th Massachusetts and their assault on the very difficult to assault Fort Wagner and the loss of life. But the 115th are there during that return to assist them in their grievous condition. It was during this, quote, lost summer, among the toils of labor, and despite being exonerated of charges, that a cabal against Colonel Sammons would emerge. Issues with Lieutenant Colonel George Sherman Batchelor escalated to a near pistol duel. There was apparently some not so nice words coming out of particularly Sammons' mouth as a superior officer. I kind of liken this, you could almost picture them both as like that scene in Bugs Bunny when the glove comes out and gets slapped across the face. There was apparently an actual hit with a glove. Real quick, you guys are familiar with Batchelor? All right. So you don't want me to tell you the little spiel I had about them? Oh. You've probably been over to the mansion. It's not that far from here. He's a Harvard-educated man from Bachelorville. Anybody's been to Bachelorville? It's a nice under-the-water community mostly now. He's actually the youngest legislator that will go from Saratoga County to the state. He's a lawyer, and fairly easy for him to get an appointment as an officer at this point. What I find interesting is, you'll find he doesn't stick around through this unit through the rest of the war, but what he does post-Civil War, with being part of the International Tribunal, where he oversees a murder trial in Egypt in which an American kills somebody and basically does convict him. It brings up a little stirs and crazies about that. I won't go into too much more, but it's definitely worth looking into. Fascinating character. But those two guys do not see eye to eye on how things are being done. Colonel Sammons is beloved by his regiment. There are some very nice things said about Batchelor as well, but those two probably had very strong personalities, both of them quite capable of leadership. And if you've ever worked in a place where you have two people more than capable of being the guy in charge or the woman in charge, you find that both of them seem to not like each other very much. In late December of 1863, the 115th will be assigned to Barton's Empire Brigade, including the 47th, 48th, and the 115th under Colonel William Barton. And I got nothing else on this slide except check out those chops, kind of like the guy in the back here. Like, it is fantastic. I wish I could do that, right? Like we were talking back there, I can't really get the mustache chin aspect of it the right way. And this is where the 115th, along with the Empire Brigade, made up of those New York regiments, will turn south. On to Florida they will go. Barton's brigade is deployed on February 5th, along with Brigadier General Truman Seymour. By the 7th of February, they will arrive in Florida, entering Jacksonville unopposed and by relative surprise to the Confederate forces in the area. The 54th Massachusetts were the first to disembark from the boats, and on that inland march, they would push back skirmishers and pickets along the rail lines toward Baldwin. There's an intersection of the railroad lines that are a vital supply hub for the Confederacy from Florida into Georgia, particularly supplying hog. Those pork products are vital to the operation. The 115th, along with the rest of Union forces, continue inland over 4 days, covering 44 miles. And while they're instructed at first to hold their positions, Seymour will eventually order them to advance against the own wishes of his superiors. And that's where they will meet at Olustee, the battlefield, on February 20th. Seymour's federal troops engage against a well-matched Confederate force made up of Florida and Georgia troops, about 5,000 to 5,000 on opposite sides of the field. The Battle of Olustee, or Ocean Pond as it's known in the South, was a nearly 3-hour slugfest in the pines. You think back on that image I just showed you of the battlefield. Along a narrow strip of dry land between Ocean Pond and swampy ground, the 115th would hold the extreme right flank. At this point, they're only 600 men strong. The casualty rate in this battle is somewhere near 40% on both sides. It's ranked within the top 5 bloodiest battles by percentage of those engaged, and the 115th would inflict more than 500 casualties on the 32nd Georgia, who held the field opposite to them. To this point, I feel like I should point out the fact that each time the 115th leveled their rifles and their muskets at the opposing line, they did so at other fathers, at other sons, and other brothers. Colonel Sammons, during this battle, would be shot in the foot and fall from his horse, receiving an injury to his foot. That takes him out of commission for a period of time. The Confederates will bring in reinforcements. Seymour is only supplying troops piecemeal along the railroad line. Confederates use the other end of the railroad line to great advantage with an organized input of their troops. It means a very disorganized withdrawal by federal troops, many being wounded and captured. James Clark, during this point in time, during the battle, he writes of 2 Saratoga County men in his company, Private Link and Corporal Milcullen. He notes them as being the tallest in the company, and it was because of their height they both received mini balls to the head. Corporal Daniel Grant, who hadn't yet received his discharge papers because of the death of his 2 brothers, meant that he would be able to go home to his widower mother, who was all alone at home on the farm, would spend 10 months in the notorious Andersonville prison in Georgia. He eventually returned to the 115th, ending out the war with them. 28 others from the 115th were not so lucky. The 115th is relieved from the rearguard action by the 54th Massachusetts as a retreat is made east back toward Jacksonville and the Federal lines. Wounded and weary, they would struggle through the night. Regimental Surgeon McFarland writes, "Fear is a terrible spur to endurance." The 115th suffered 188 wounded, 62 dead. That's 51% of those that were engaged that day. Though the battle was tough, they stood against the maelstrom and proved themselves. It's a form of their own redemption after the demoralizing occurrence of Harpers Ferry. The disastrous accusations of arson, I'll get to that. I'm trying to get the audio to stop while I read this. From Camp Douglas, their war record could now show that they stood in the face of the enemy in the fiercest of fighting, and they did so strongly against that force. Colonel Batchelor, as you can see here, had left, and that means that the lieutenant colonel nominee, who happened to be killed in action because of a gunshot, Captain Garrett Vanderveer, who had been killed during this, was not able to take over as colonel of the regiment, so it falls underneath the command of Major Ezra Walrath. The 115th will spend months in Florida being outpaced by their tents until they arrive on April 6th. Camp is set up neatly, and get this, almost immediately the 115th, the flying regiment, was sent back to Virginia. It's also, when they spend that time in Florida, is the only occurrence that the 115th has of one of their own receiving a Medal of Honor accommodation. The brief story about that is that Company B and E were asked to provide raids up and along Georgia and parts of Florida to capture troops and intelligence to find out what's going on. And Private Thraken, he's a part of it, amongst a few others, but he is the most tenacious when it comes to after the war, where he goes on a personal 24-year-long quest to have that part of his service recognized and awarded the Medal of Honor. And he is the only one to have been given the Medal of Honor from the regiment. At some point, he just kept on mailing it in. I think he wore somebody down. So they are in Virginia, and they are back into the Bermuda 100, the Bermuda 100. Barton's Empire Brigade is reassigned to the Army of the James underneath General Benjamin Butler, known as the Beast Butler, right? If anybody's familiar with his reputation of New Orleans, the women of that city did not like him at all. He didn't like the women of that city either. The 115th will arrive in Virginia on April 20th and become part of the Army's 10th Corps, stationed within the Bermuda 100 in early May, and several small skirmishes and battles in that area are part of a federal plan to kind of unnerve the Confederacy, as General Grant with the Army of the Potomac positions themselves to assault the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Many of those battles that the Army of the James would engage in are less about the topographical strategy, more about the strategy of, again, kind of keeping Lee's troops on their heels or otherwise engaged. And this is becoming the quite obvious war of attrition. the Federal troops can send supplies and men into the churning battles and war a lot more than Confederacy. This is the idea that they're going to be running the Confederacy low on all their resources. Butler's command, however, would be bungled at this point in time, as Grant would eventually recognize that Butler allowed his forces to move slow enough for Confederate counterattacks, placing them in a, quote, bottle strongly corked. It was in this bottle that the 115th found themselves under new leadership of a man apparently well familiar with a bottle. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Johnson, who comes from the 93rd New York, takes command. The troops of the 115th are angry that an outsider to the regiment will come in, and they feel that Major Walworth should have been given the promotion to oversee, as he'd been doing a fine job of leading the regiment in the absence of Colonel Sammons and after the departure of Lieutenant Colonel Batchelor. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's first command of the regiment was on the 20th of May, and by the 24th he was arrested for drunkenness on duty. 2 days later, the 115th are attached to the 8th Corps alongside the Army of the Potomac. They're sent on a circuitous 155-mile march to reach Cold Harbor, which has only been 15 miles away. General Grant and General Sheridan were in a race to beat Confederate General Lee to the harbor, but they were too late. Sheridan gained some earthworks, but with no other real effect. On June 1st, the 115th would see action as part of a 30,000-man force on the 6th and 8th Corps, storming the earthwork and capturing nearly 200 Confederates. By June 3rd, Grant would be bogged down, ordering a frontal assault, losing nearly 7,000 soldiers in just a few short minutes. He later would note that it was his biggest regret. And this began the long entrenchment duties in Virginia for so many soldiers. June 12th, the 115th will pull out of their position on the line and head to Petersberg with Grant's Army of the Potomac, where the regiment is returned to the 10th Corps under Butler, who fails to take advantage of the Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard's withdrawal and enter siege warfare. The 115th take their positions on the siege line along the Appomattox River, directly opposite the 43rd Alabama. It's a static, fairly good-natured trading, and they've decided that they're not going to shoot at each other. It's a gentleman's discussion. You're over there, we're over here. You stay over there, we'll stay over here. You don't shoot at us, we don't shoot at you. Why don't you send over some tobacco? Well, you send over some coffee. You got some newspapers? Does anybody watch the old series North and the South back in the day? They're a pretty good example of that kind of thing where they were trading back and forth. Everybody wanted a good conversation. Everybody wanted to hear the news from the other side. Newspapers were a highly traded commodity. And on June 22nd, it's noted that Lincoln will ride through the camp. There's no cheers. They notice that he's very sullen. He looks much older than anybody had anticipated. Weeks of siege line duties continue with picket, trenching, digging, pitch it, trench it, digging, burying the dead, and keeping your head down. 10 dead from the 115th, 25 wounded, and 2 missing by the end of June to early July. Post-Independence Day, the U.S. Sanitary Commission delivers goods such as soap, tobacco, and tea, stationery and food, some books. Particularly, it was noted they were very happy to receive books sent from the church, as there was not so much of religious reading materials available to them. Probably some other reading materials, too, slightly curated by folks either back at home or the Sanitary Commission, books that aligned with the ideology of this war, which I hopefully will remember to make a comment about later. That's called foreshadowing. It doesn't work so well if I tell you that I did it, though, does it? Mid-July, Colonel Sammons will return to the siege lines after 5 months of recouping his injury to his eye in Florida. Florida seems like a halfway decent to recoup. If you're gonna be convalescing for 5 months, you might as well do it in Florida. It's at this time, though, he's actually sending some letters home to his family. There's actually some amazing little drawings that still survive that he drew for his daughters of what he saw in that area. He was a lover of natural history, and there's birds and other plant species that he would draw pictures of and send home. The end of July, the unit is reassigned to Bell's Brigade, and Colonel Sammons fully reinstated as command, and the return of Lieutenant Colonel Johnson as well. The 115th will move along the trench lines to a new position. That's where you have to mine the crater. On June 25th, the 510-foot shaft completed underneath the Confederate works exploded. 4 tons of powder had been placed. Actually, I'm sorry, that's July 29th. The 115th had prepared that morning around 5 a.m., and then they waited. And they waited. And eventually that crater opens up a wide 200-foot hole, 25 feet deep in the Confederate line, and Federal troops from the 9th Corps, mostly green USCT troops, pour in. The 115th are to the left flank of their division, putting them just right of the crater and the hole that swallowed up 300 South Carolinians. Because of lack of leadership, being improperly prepared, this crowded mess that goes into the crater will devolve into complete chaos. The Confederates reorganize and panic ensues. See, the troops weren't given ladders or any way to get back out the other side of the crater. The USCT retreats, running headlong into their own troops. It's at this point in James Clark's reminiscence and other military records that the officers of the 115th, as well as other Federal troops, tried to stem the tide of what they called the Negro Flood, as these USCT troops tried to get back out, being fully aware of the Confederate policy that blacks were not to be taken prisoner. Blacks in arms against the Confederacy were to be killed on the spot. The Confederates focused their fire down into the crater and across the mass of Union soldiers. A saving grace would be that the steep edges of that crater were so great that they could not wheel up cannons and pour grape shot into it. They could not lower the cannon to an elevation to do so. It's at this point that Colonel Sammons is shot in the thigh as he's leading his troops, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Johnson in command of the 115th. As they withdraw in the chaos with the most of the rest of the Federal troops, the regiment suffers only 4 dead, 16 wounded, but 5 missing. And they return to the siege lines and coffee. Lieutenant Clark writes in his regimental history, "Our coffee has arrived. We have eaten nothing since yesterday, are streaming with perspiration, and the coffee is very hot. Yet how delicious, how delightful it is to taste it, within a fort of dead men, and sitting over human blood and brains, yet all calmly sip their coffee." Soon the 115th will return to Bermuda 100 after 37 days straight on the front line. On August 13th, the regiment moves out for Deep Bottom, Virginia, with the 10th Corps, now underneath Brigadier General Alfred Terry. They'll skirmish, minor battles here and there. At this point, there's only about 200 men that make up the fighting component of the 115th. And in this point in time, skirmishing around Deep Bottom and the conflict there brings back a battle return of 16 dead, 35 wounded, and 22 missing. So in 2 years of service, the 115th, formerly 1,000 bright boys in blue, are reduced to less than 100 active soldiers. By the end of August 1864, the 115th returns to the siege lines outside of Petersberg, and the end of September, the regiment will move out with the 10th Corps for Newmarket Heights in a feigning attempt to threaten Richmond. The Union keeps extending the siege line in order to spread out Confederate troops, and the end of October sees a new group of recruits to the 115th, along with some returning vets that are coming back from convalescing injury or other illness, putting the review at only 225 active soldiers of the 115th. Excitement in mid-October as the election of 1864. Ballots are mailed for local, state, and presidential election, and most of 115th and the Union Army, that is, vote Lincoln over George B. McClellan. Down with the Copperheads and Peace Democrats. Captain Shaw of the Company E writes to a friend in July of that year, actually a little bit before that, "I should think Copperheadism was pretty well played out. Their hopes of a Southern Confederacy to lean upon must be growing bright over on the left. Sorry to say we have one or two with us with very long faces on account of the failure. The thing is fixed. The die is cast. Rebels and Copperhead Tories have got to go to the wall. The cause is unholy, being conceived in sin." It's also interesting in this letter that he begins kind of condensing and paraphrasing from Werner's Pride, a book that had just been released in 1863. Apparently who he was writing to, they were conversing about this book, one of those probably curated U.S. Commission books that he'd picked up along the way. Talks about how a family will fall apart when it mistrusts itself and each other after the death of the uncle and the inheritance of the nephew, not the sons. They set up winter camp in early November 1864, but the Flying Infantry takes off again on Thanksgiving Day. By December 5th, the regiment crosses the James River with a newly formed 24th Corps and absorbs into the 8th and 10th, that will absorb the 8th and 10th Corps. The 115th is still in Bell's brigade, but the new division commander was Brigadier General Adelbert Ames. Adelbert is a fantastic name, and I'll say it a couple more times if I need to because it's fun to say. Adelbert. The Army is on the move, and they set sail for Fortress Monroe on December 7th. This is part of the slow strangle of the Confederacy. You're familiar with the Anaconda? Where they are trying to stop all of the trade with Europe in particular the Confederacy would have. They have a blockade around the South. Blockade runners are very integral to the success so far of the Confederacy. The Confederate port at Wilmington, North Carolina remains open, unfortunately, for blockade runners bringing European supplies into the Cape Fear River that is defended by the impregnable Fort Fisher. A joint operation to take the fort, Admiral David Porter and our favorite little bungler, General Butler, means that a variety of ships that include 619 naval guns, 6,500 infantry, there's cavalry and artillery on these ships, are being sent down to take Fort Fisher. And there are delays, which means that the infantry, again, infantry, they're supposed to be on the land, right? They spend over 2 weeks aboard ships awaiting assault on the fortress in December. It's at this point that Butler gets this fanciful idea that we will take the steamship Louisiana, strip it of its armaments, and outfit it with 215 tons of powder, and we'll just float that next to the fort. And we'll detonate it within 300 yards of the fort, which happened at 1:46 a.m. on Christmas Eve, and no effect on the fort was had at all. I imagine that the Confederates inside probably thought it was a really interesting way to celebrate Christmas Eve. At daylight, the 56 warships open up, sending 10,000 rounds in 5 hours into the hardy sand fort. The land face of the fort was to be assaulted. An amphibious landing placed 2,200 infantry on the beach on Christmas morning to make their approach on eerily quiet fortress. The Confederates laid low during that bombardment, and Butler would eventually call off that assault, seeing that there was no effect from the shelling, and few of the men on the ground, and too few men on the ground to take the fort. So at this point, Private Reardon of the 115th states, quote, As we are so soon done for, it's a wonder what we've begun for. With the exception of a Christmas beach excursion, the men of the 115th had spent 22 days afloat, and the worst yet, upon their return to camp on the James River, while their expedition was away, their camp was looted, and packages from home, personal baggage, had all been plundered. Early January, the flying infantry was on the move again. This time, General Terry was in charge of the expedition against Fort Fisher. They still need to take this fort. More men, more supplies. That's more better, right? Another coordinated naval and army attack, this time with 8,900 soldiers, 59 warships, 627 guns were sent to face a garrison of 1,900 North and South Carolina, Georgia Confederate troops. It was the largest amphibious landing of American troops until D-Day 1944, 79 years later. This mid-January 1865 assault on the fort involved naval bombardment to clear the landing beaches, more directed shelling on the fortress gun batteries themselves. A more well-coordinated attack also meant the defenders lacked the time to repair the works. Navy men had volunteered to participate with their cutlasses and revolvers, storming the beach. They attacked the extreme western end of the fortress on the land face, and the pioneers, sort of like the CBs of their time, the engineers, chopped out holes, creating in the palisade walls so that they could frontally assault that bastion. They were covered by sharpshooters, so these men could do their work, picking off Confederates who rose at the top edge of the fort and shooting them down in the advance of the blue tide. Darkness would begin to fall, but the Union troops would take the fort, slowly and often hand by hand, across the parapets. And after 7 hours of fighting, the fort was surrendered around 10 p.m. that evening, and the fierce battle would come to an end. Pretty good time to curl up and bivouac for the night. Lay out your roll and get a few hours of shut-eye. 3 regiments do so upon the ground inside the fort, and beneath them, unknowingly to those getting a few moments of rest, 13,000 pounds of gunpowder. Around 8 a.m., it exploded, swallowing up or blowing apart many souls. Several of the men were buried in sand between 1 to 10 feet deep. The battle claimed 2 from the 115th, 17 wounded. The explosion the next morning killed 11 and wounded 41. James Getman of Nelliston was nearly entirely consumed by sand, except for his left hand that stuck out. Corporal Fred Meyer, seeing the hand, dug Getman out of his grave. Getman came to the surface with only one shoe, the other somewhere lost in the explosion or to the sand. If you're at all interested in seeing Getman's shoe, it is in the Margaret Reaney collection, St. Johnsville Library. It's not always on display, but they do have his shoe. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Johnson ascends as the ranking officer of the new Fort Fisher Union garrison for about 3 weeks. Federal troops will continue to capture blockade runners. Get this, you're on a boat, you're coming back with supplies. You show up and you're expecting to see a Confederate guy welcoming you to the doorstep, and instead it's a bunch of Union soldiers and you're under arrest. It's also this point that Johnson relishes in the fact of being able to assign his correspondent the first federal commander of Fort Fisher. General Grant will begin pressing the issue around Richmond, Virginia, as General Sherman will march across the South, leaving devastation in his wake. Grant wants Wilmington, and the new Department of North Carolina is deployed on February of 1865, and the 115th take to wings again as part of General Terry's General Terry's troops of about 8,000 men. They'll take Wilmington on February 22nd. That's just about a year since Olustee. The 115th are grateful not to make a frontal assault. The 115th is part of the corps that advances northeast to Northeast Station as the Confederates begin releasing their prisoners of war. A tactic meant to burden advancing Union troops and slow their pace. Thousands of walking skeletons, 10,000 in a week, stream across the line from railroad cars and wagons and across pontoon bridges. Some, in fact, are old veterans of the 115th, such as Nathaniel Baker, a boy from Saratoga County, who had been captured at Olustee, been shot in the foot, and while his comrades tried to help him off the field and he was crawling, and they carried him and he was crawling in that retreat as the Confederates advanced, he pleaded with them to go on and leave him behind. It was better, he said, for them to capture one than all three. In early April, the 115th are attached to a unit that supports the advancing army of General Sherman as he staggers Confederate General Joseph Johnston back into Virginia. On their march, they will learn of Lee's surrender to Grant. And just days later, they learn of Johnston's surrender to Sherman. It's also on their march as they continue toward Raleigh, North Carolina, that they learn of Lincoln's assassination. And the 115th will remain in Raleigh for several weeks as the Johnston surrender clears, and the 115th Regiment of Flying Infantry musters out of service there on June 17th, 1865. And they'll miss the grand parades of Washington and in other locations celebrating Union victory. But they're grateful to see the end of the war. A war that took them to several places, thousands of miles. Unit reports 330 dead, 82 killed in action, mortal wounds 57, disease 191, explosion 11, died as POWs 54, non-fatal wounds over 450. Over 800 dead or wounded of the 1,300 who would fight for the 115th. Recruits had come in to fill those other ranks, and those that had not served their full term as recruits were moved to the 47th New York Volunteers. Just a listing of Harpers Ferry to Olustee, Cold Harbor and Petersberg, Fort Fisher, and eventually the end of the war. The 115th would move again, this time toward home on June 19, 1865. 280 men boarded a train headed to Petersburg and then boarded the steamer ship North Point at City Point on the James River on June 23rd. They would reach New York Harbor on June 25th and up the Hudson River on the Thomas Way to Albany, to much fanfare, meals, speeches, and parades. They would spend 8 days in Albany, awaiting their official discharge from the Union Army and pay, which finally came on July 3rd, 1865. Imagine at that point, these boys in blue are ready to celebrate their own form of Independence Day, as the nation celebrates another birthday on July 4th. James Clark wrote, "And the 115th ceased to exist, except in the memory of a grateful people." We're here this evening to give life back to the 115th as they enter into our memory and carry on. They exist in each of us now. But this is, again, not a full, complete regimental history. You can't talk about all of the people that fought. There are many more names, many more skirmishes and battles that exist for the 115th. I highly recommend Silo's book, if you can pick that up someplace from the library or available online. Mark Silo is also a fairly local person. As of last I knew, he was still living in Loudonville. So I would highly recommend that you check that out. There's online sources for James Clark's book if you want to read that. And I see that there's some really great other pieces of Saratoga County history here on the tables. And I want to thank you all for coming out and being a part of this evening. I would entertain questions if there are any, if there's time for it. Feel free to ask it. If I don't know an answer, I will let you know. Thanks.